The war that the United States and Israel launched against Iran has caused the largest global oil crisis in history, and we're just beginning to see the impact. This could cause a global economic crisis, so it's very important to understand what exactly is happening, and that's why we created this presentation today. Now, we are recording this analysis on the 24th of April, nearly 2 months into this war that was launched by the US and Israel on the 28th of February. And technically, there is a ceasefire that is temporary but has been extended, although this has been referred to as Schrodinger's ceasefire in a reference to the famous physics experiment of Schrodinger's cat, which is simultaneously alive and dead. The observer does not know until they actually open the box and observe what happens. So similarly, the ceasefire is simultaneously happening and not happening. The US has been constantly violating the ceasefire, and Israel. And one day Trump announces a naval blockade against Iran, and then he says the war is going to end. And this comes after the initial rounds of peace talks that were held between the US and Iran in the Pakistani capital of Islamabad failed. But regardless of what exactly the state of the war is, that is not super relevant to this analysis today, because even if there's a miracle and the war immediately ends, that does not mean the energy crisis is over. On the contrary, we are just seeing the beginning of the energy crisis unleashed by this war. And that crisis will go on for months, or even potentially, the chief of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has warned that the economic impact of this energy crisis could be felt for years. Now, the IEA published a report in March that described this as, quote, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, end quote. It is even larger than the OPEC oil embargo in 1973 and the other oil crisis in 1979 that was caused by the Iranian Revolution. And both of those energy crises led to stagflation in the 1970s, by the way, which is simultaneous economic stagnation, low growth, or even a recession with inflation. Typically, when you have a recession, you have deflation, and when you have inflation, you have an overheated economy that is growing fast. Stagflation is the worst of both worlds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk more about the impact on the global economy a bit later in this analysis today. First, I want to explain why the International Energy Agency has described this oil supply crisis as even worse than the crises of the 1970s. And this is because, in response to the US-Israeli war of aggression, Iran took an extremely important decision to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, in the oil crises of the 1970s, this did not happen. This is the first time in modern history that Iran has taken advantage of its geopolitical position to close down this strait. So what exactly is the Strait of Hormuz? This has been described by the US government's Energy Information Administration, the EIA, as, quote, the world's most important oil transit choke point, end quote. Before the US launched this war, roughly 20% of all of the oil consumed around the world on a daily basis passed through this very narrow strait right off the coast of Iran. And this not only is significant because Iran is a major oil and natural gas producer, but also because many other oil and natural gas producers in the Persian Gulf region, the Gulf monarchies, they also rely on sending their oil and liquefied natural gas through this very narrow strait. So countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar have found it very difficult to export a lot of their energy. And very few ships have been able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. I'm looking at data here from Bloomberg, the US financial media outlet, and it only goes until early April, but you can see that before the US and Israel launched this war at the end of February, there were about 50 tankers going into and out of the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. After the US and Israel launched this war, and in self-defense, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, you can see that on a daily basis, there was a small handful of ships passing through that you can count on one hand. Although I should say that Iran did decide to make some exceptions. In particular, Iran allows tankers from countries that it considers friendly, that are not helping the West to wage war against it. For instance, China and India, along with Russia and Pakistan, have all been given the green light to send tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. However, Tehran has made a very important demand. It wants the oil that is passing through the strait to be sold in China's currency, renminbi or yuan, not US dollars, which is an extremely important geopolitical decision because this is a direct challenge to the global dominance of the US dollar via the petrodollar system. The fact that for a century now, the vast majority, nearly all of the global oil traded on the global market was traded in US dollars, and then those petrodollars were recycled into US financial markets, especially the stock market and the bond market, and also real estate that helps to inflate the value of real estate. And this keeps these massive bubbles in these US financial markets inflated, which makes rich people in the US even richer because 90% of stocks, roughly 90%, are owned by the richest 10% of the US population. However, with all of that said, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz not only hurts the United States, but many countries around the world. The fact that Iran took this very extreme decision to shut down the Strait of Hormuz is a reflection of the fact, it demonstrates that Iran was very concerned about its future. For Iran, this is an existential war. The US and Israel are trying to overthrow the Iranian government and carry out state collapse. This is why Iran decided to close the Strait of Hormuz. And Trump's announcement that the US military would blockade Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, to blockade the blockaders, this has only made the situation even worse and further destabilized global energy markets. And like I said, it's not only impacting the US and the petrodollar system because oil is a global market, and in particular, the majority of the oil that transits the Strait of Hormuz actually goes to other parts of Asia. Of course, the so-called Middle East, what continent is it in? It's in Asia. It's West Asia. That's a more accurate term. And the oil in West Asia is largely shipped to East Asia and South Asia. So for instance, 38% of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China, 15% goes to India, 12% goes to South Korea. It is true that the West is not very dependent on oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz. About 4% goes to Europe and only 2.5% goes to the US. However, as I'll explain later, this does not mean that this oil crisis is not hurting Europe and the US. Both are being very significantly impacted negatively and facing potential economic crises and energy crises due to this closure, because even though they don't get oil directly from the Strait of Hormuz, oil is traded on a global market. And when the price of oil skyrockets because of a supply shock, because of a shortage in supply, that impacts every country on Earth. I'll talk about that in a few minutes here. First, I want to talk a bit more about how this energy crisis is impacting Asia, because this is the region of the world that has been the most hurt by this war started by the US and Israel. In particular, East Asia and Southeast Asia, because these are regions that do not have lots of domestic oil supplies. China, for instance, does have some domestic oil production. It's a significant oil producer, but it has 1.4 billion people, so it still imports a lot of oil. Japan consists of a series of islands. It has basically no domestic oil production, and Japan imports 95% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. Japan does have a stockpile, but regardless, you can see how this is an extreme crisis for Japan. Similarly, South Korea gets 70% of its oil from this region. The situation in Southeast Asia is even more desperate. The Philippines, which is one of the poorest countries in the region, imported 98% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, basically all of it. And this is why the Philippines was the first country on earth to officially declare a national emergency. And the Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia that are dependent on oil imports have already reduced the workday to 4 days a week. They've reduced school days. They've told some government workers to work from home. They've cut back public transportation. They're rationing energy. This is a massive crisis. And like I said, it is not only hurting Asia. Europe has also been acutely affected by this war started by the US and Israel, because Europe is another region of the world that is very dependent on importing its energy. And EU officials have actually already warned that they're going to have to implement policies to cut back use of oil. And they're even discussing rationing, which would make it difficult for many people to buy gasoline, if they can even afford gasoline, or petrol as it's called in the UK, because first of all, the price has skyrocketed. But second of all, even if they have the money, they might not be able to buy it because of rationing. And this not only impacts the global energy market, but also the global food market. And a UN agency warned that this US-Israeli war in Iran could cause a catastrophe in global food production, because the Persian Gulf region produces many of the chemical compounds that are used in fertilizers, like urea, for instance. And now many farmers around the world, especially in the global south, cannot get access to fertilizers. And this comes during planting season. So this means that a few months from now, we're going to start seeing shortages of food. We're not seeing this immediately, but in a few months, the farmers who are not able to get the fertilizer they needed to plant their crops now, in a few months, their harvests are going to be much smaller, which means there are going to be food shortages, which means that the price of food is going to increase drastically all around the world. And that means that global south countries are potentially going to have mass hunger, because poor people in global south countries are not going to be able to pay the higher prices. And food is largely traded by these commodity traders on the global market, and they're going to prioritize selling that food to richer countries where consumers have higher disposable income. Although even average consumers are going to feel the impact, even in wealthier countries in the global north, because they're going to have significant inflation. Their purchasing power is going to fall. So once again, this war that the US and Israel launched against Iran is having a massive impact on the global economy in many sectors. And we're just beginning to see the impact now in April, 2 months later. And months from now, it's likely going to be even worse. So I've talked about the impact on Europe, the impact on Southeast Asia, on Japan and South Korea. I also want to spend a minute or two here talking about the impact on China. Of course, China is the second most populous country on earth with 1.4 billion people. And China is the largest trading partner of most countries on earth, including the Persian Gulf region. And China is the biggest oil importer on earth. So obviously, one would expect that this US-Israeli war would hurt China. However, that said, China has been preparing for a potential crisis like this for months, if not years. Let's not forget the US and Israel launched the so-called 12-day war against Iran in June 2025. And following that war, China suspected the US and Israel would launch another war. So China began to stockpile oil. It didn't start in 2025, but it significantly increased its purchases of oil, which, by the way, is what a government should do when the global price of oil is low. You're supposed to buy low, not buy when the price is high, which now many countries that don't have oil in their stockpiles, they're freaking out and trying to buy oil when the price is significantly higher. China has reserves of roughly 1.2 or 1.3 billion barrels of oil. And that means that China has roughly 4 months worth of its oil imports in its stockpile. However, no one knows when exactly this war will end. I certainly hope that 4 months from now, and well before then, this war will end. But even if the war does end much sooner than that, as I've been stressing, the energy impact here is going to be felt for months, if not years, because some of the oil and natural gas infrastructure in the Persian Gulf has been damaged or destroyed in this war, and it will take months, if not years, to rebuild it. And even if the infrastructure has not been destroyed, many of the Persian Gulf countries have cut back their production of oil because they don't have enough storage capacity. And you can't just magically increase and decrease oil production by several million barrels of oil per day. Once you decrease oil production, it takes you several weeks, if not well over a month, to ramp up that production to the previous levels. This infrastructure is very complex. It's not like an on and off switch for your lighting in your house. But anyway, getting back to the issue of China and how the energy crisis is impacting China, I need to stress that another reason why China has not been as greatly hurt by this oil crisis is simply because in recent years, China has been diversifying its energy sources, and China has now become the world leader in renewable energy technology. In fact, Yale University estimated that China is building twice as much wind and solar power capacity as the rest of the world combined. Every year, China adds more solar power capacity than all of the West has ever installed. Moreover, if you've been to China, if you've been to a tier 1 major city like Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, if you go out on the road and you look at the license plates of cars, you can see that about half of the cars, if not more, are electric vehicles. They have a green license plate. EVs have become extremely popular in China. China has more than 100 EV companies. And this means that China now needs to import less oil for gasoline. It still uses oil for industrial purposes, but China's been electrifying its vehicles and many other parts of the economy, which of course also helps to combat climate change. And China's carbon emissions have already peaked and they're going to be falling from now. But it's not just an issue of climate change and pollution, which is another problem. A decade ago, China had very bad pollution and it's gotten better. But it's not just because of these environmental reasons, but also a national security issue and an energy security issue. China recognizes that the more renewable energy capacity it has, the less dependent it is on foreign energy imports. And this war that the US and Israel launched against Iran is a great example of why China has been trying to focus on increasing domestic renewable energy production for national security reasons. But with all of that said, I now want to talk about the impact on the United States, the country that started this crisis in the first place in a totally unnecessary war of aggression in violation of international law. Now, the rhetoric coming out of the Donald Trump White House has been very misleading, and I thought it would be very important to correct what Trump has been claiming. Trump insists that the U.S. is energy independent, and Trump supporters keep repeating this falsehood. It's simply not true. Trump also claimed that the U.S. does not depend on energy coming from the Middle East, from West Asia. Therefore, he claims the U.S. will not be adversely impacted by the war he started against Iran. This is completely false because even though the U.S. only gets 5% of its oil imports from Saudi Arabia, the price of oil is global and the U.S. imports 8 million barrels of oil per day. So it doesn't matter if the U.S. is not importing that oil from West Asia because U.S. oil importers still have to pay more money because the price of oil is global and the price of crude has skyrocketed due to this U.S.-Israeli war. But regardless, the point that I'm going to conclude with today, the most important point you should all take away from this analysis, is that this war that the U.S. and Israel launched against Iran could cause a global economic crisis. I'm looking here at a paper that was published by the group Oxford Economics, warning that this war could cause a global recession. And as I mentioned earlier, this could bring back stagflation, which was a devastating feature of the 1970s, which is simultaneous economic stagnation or even recession, so very low growth rates or negative growth rates, in addition to simultaneous inflation, stagflation, stagnation plus inflation. This would be catastrophic for countries around the world because it means that average people's wages, their purchasing power in real terms will be falling, while at the same time, there are fewer jobs. There are fewer economic opportunities. Stagflation is the worst of both worlds, and this war could very well cause a significant crisis of stagflation. This is why I thought it would be so important to make this presentation to help people understand how the US-Israeli war against Iran is truly a global conflict that will impact countries and people all around the world. This is not isolated to Iran. This is not isolated to West Asia. This will have a huge impact on your country, wherever you're living, on your economy, on your energy market, on your food market, and on your standard of living. On that note, I will conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.